Autotelic Foundry.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much for the invitation to speak today. Normally, I speak to military audiences, so this is a change. This is nice. The good news is there's a lot that I will be talking about that follows on directly from what Paul has talked about. The bad news is perhaps that I will be speaking about a lot of military power and cold hard cash, and I'll speak for a little bit longer than he did. So we find ourselves in interesting times, I would say. These are times where spending on AI projects globally are at an unprecedented high. They're an unprecedented rise. And there's also an unprecedented rise in global military expenditures, especially in Europe and in the Middle East. And increasingly the expenditures on artificial intelligence and the expenditures on military technologies become deeply entangled with one another. And with this entanglement comes a certain dynamic, which I would say enrolls us all into a world, or perhaps into a cult, of careless investments, crude imaginations, and perhaps cybernetic idiocy. So this is loosely what I'll be talking about to you today. In her reflections on war, Simone Weil wrote many decades ago that, and here's a quote, "One can neither solve nor even pose a problem relating to war without first taking into account the mechanisms of the military struggle, that is, without first analyzing the social relationships implied by war under the given technical, economic, and social conditions." So she wrote this in 1933 when the signs of a looming war were very clearly on the horizon, the signs that all economic life would now move to an impending war, she writes. So today, we are in an environment where conflicts are either raging or brewing across the globe, and where calls for large-scale efforts to mobilize financial resources and new technologies in the service of new militarism are swelling, at least in the Anglo-American sphere, but also certainly across Europe. Last year, the military AI startup Anduril, a company that is valued, started at 2017 and is valued at a staggering $28 billion US. So this company announced its plans to invest $1 billion US to build a huge factory for the mass production of AI-enabled autonomous weapon systems, thousands of autonomous weapon systems a year, churning through, mirroring certain World War II efforts, and certainly having some echoes of the Manhattan Project. The Manhattan Project was, of course, the unprecedented, top-tier, top-secret US government initiative which tried to beat the Germans in developing a weapon so destructive that it would surely decide the fate of the world. I'm talking, of course, of the atom bomb. It was a very large-scale military-civilian effort, demanding billions in financial resources, millions in human resources, and effectively really turning all of America into one huge factory, as Niels Bohr said at the time, a factory for spectral violence in some ways. The project itself ushered in the nuclear age, under which we have lived ever since. And with it, it ushered also in the ability to imagine the physical annihilation of all human, of all animal, and of all plant life. The apocalypse becomes not a metaphor, but an actual possibility. Throughout the last year, certainly, the specter of the Manhattan Project was repeatedly conjured up in media, through pundits, and in various government initiatives and through various government commissions as an exemplar for how innovation and technological progress can and should be done, especially in perilous times. What we need, it was often proclaimed, was a Manhattan Project-style AI initiative in which both civilians and military talent need to be mobilized in order to deter the enemy or beat the enemy. Now, bringing the trope of the Manhattan Project to bear on the present moment is just like reviving the tired and tortured image of Robert Oppenheimer a couple of years ago. It's a peculiar and a particular kind of revisionism, but it tells us something about the ambitions of a looming new militarism today, in which technology industries, which of course themselves have spawned out of the efforts of military necessity, have kind of come full circle back into entangling the civilian into the military and wrapping the conditions for peace very clumsily and uncomfortably around new technologies for violence as such. New defense companies dealing in AI-enabled weapon systems have adopted this refrain in particular, and the current wars in Gaza and, of course, Ukraine also have tragically given uplift to this framing war for peace as an idea. Private equity financiers, especially venture capital investors, we'll come back to those guys in a minute, are called upon to set aside their qualms about profiteering from war and take up their moral duty, it is said, to prop up the new military technology industries with abundant cash. Military startups themselves, I've just got a selection here of the more prominent ones, advertise their products as in the service of democracy, as tools to achieve victory without war, as a necessary means to defend the West, and so on. Of course, nothing says peace like a swarm of 40-pound AI-enabled autonomous missiles with a lung damage radius of 10 meters each on impact. It's perhaps useful to stress at this point that the military AI business is an extremely, extremely lucrative opportunity in terms of investment. The military AI market was estimated to be worth just over $9.2 billion in 2023, and it is estimated to triple at least reach to just under $40 billion to $55 billion in the next 5 to 6 years. So there's a tremendous opportunity for investment. And valuations for some of the companies that make AI systems, some of these companies here, have soared to stratospheric spheres in the last 3 to 5 years. So it's little wonder then that all the big players in the technology industry want to have a slice of this particularly promising pie. More broadly, all of the technology elites that we are familiar with, and that includes military startups as well as all the top companies, Google, Microsoft, Amazon, Meta, they all have firmly set their eyes on the defense sector at large as their next target for disruption. Defense AI ecosystems are popping up absolutely everywhere, hoping to forge for the defense sector what is already commonplace in the civilian environment, and that is forging a digital infrastructure, kind of a digital infrastructure monopoly that creates a certain lock-in with products like AI target recommendation systems, easily replicable AI drones, large language model-based strategic planning tools, and so on. Now, despite the promise of AI as more discerning, discriminating, and precise, these are the kinds of tropes that are often raised in favor of AI types of weapon systems. The fact is that to date, these systems, as they are intended for use in a kind of open and complex battlefield, they are not very robust and they're not very reliable for the messy business of war. This is the very famous picture of the turtle, which turns with just one shift of a pixel into a rifle, ultimately, as it is recognized by an AI system. There's also a very well-known problem of adequate, accurate, and appropriate data for a dynamic environment, such as conflict zones, especially urban conflict zones. There's a problem with keeping the systems up to date. There's a problem with problem orphaning, meaning what the AI can do is often not the problem you actually have, so you end up with a solution that is different to the problem, but the original problem then becomes orphaned as such. So there's a lot of problems with these AI systems that we already know, so for the context of warfare, this is quite perilous. There's also not any safeguard in place to suggest that AI systems will be calibrated or used in a way that restrains violence. Quite the contrary seems actually more likely. Now, despite all this, the promises made about military AI systems are quite fantastical. Claims that AI will help win wars very swiftly, or that war is just a software problem. That AI can make the globe very transparent and so on. Those are a staple in this realm, and they fuel projects like this very ambitious Joint All-Domain Command and Control program. It's a US Department of Defense program that really strives for perfect connectivity, data connectivity that is, for real-time action at speed and scale across all domains, ideally across multiple domains, across multiple global arenas. So that is from the space to the ocean floor, all of the domains, air, land, sea, cyber, and also space. The analogy that is often used, that the Department of Defense often uses to explain how this vision should work, is Uber, right? So except for hailing a ride or a cab, you coordinate missiles anywhere, everywhere, at any moment in the world. Now, where there are AI products and AI startups, venture capital is seldom far away. In recent years, venture capital investments in defense startups have absolutely surged, with VCs putting some 130 billion US dollars into the defense sector. That was quite unusual only 10 years ago that these kinds of numbers would be seen in this sector. And even though venture capital money for startups is still relatively small fries compared to the overall market, the global market is 2.7 trillion US dollars. The venture capital logic, and specifically Silicon Valley logic, is starting to have quite an outsized bearing on the direction of military practices and military cultures, quite worryingly, actually. Now, venture capital itself has very different needs than other businesses and financial business models in the defense market. The primary aim for venture capital companies is to make extraordinary returns for their investors. So these are not small returns, these are big, big, big returns. Venture capital then deals in high risk, high reward opportunities that pay off over a period of time of usually 10 to 15 years. And it is often presented, venture capital is often presented as being the way forward for young, budding, innovative entrepreneurs in creating a better world. But really every VC portfolio is ultimately a high stakes bet on something. The products for VC companies is not the actual technology product or a technology firm. The product for a venture capital company is growth. And that is important. So growth in terms of valuations, which results then in growth in returns. But at the bottom of all of this is always a wager of sorts. Because between 75 to 90% of all startups that are supported by venture capital, between 75 to 90% fail. So there's a very small percentage that actually succeeds, and that is built into the venture capital high risk, high reward strategy or logic as such. And the few startups that make it really big generate such outsized returns that it all works out really super spectacularly for the VC sector, or at least it has done so in the last 2 decades, which is why there's so much money sloshing around in the sector itself. Now, a successful startup must grow very fast, and it must demonstrate really, really big ambitions, revolutionary technology, game changer, all of that kind of stuff. And it needs to do so in order to be able to raise repeated rounds of funding for, Series A to Series D kind of rounds, usually in intervals of 12 to 18 months. And with each round of successful funding, the valuation of a company should ideally go up, and the company should be on a path to hypergrowth. Now, venture capital companies have strategies to make that happen. This financial logic really incentivizes a dynamic in which future-oriented imaginaries become quite crucial. It becomes about selling a fantasy, a construct, a vision. And often these imaginaries center on both quite fantastical promises, but also quite terrifying threats. In the context of military AI startups, this means promising a perfect technology against an always latent, terrifying threat or potential crisis. Now, these kinds of imaginaries are particularly evident with a recurring cast of venture capital affiliated characters who are really driving this new military enterprise forward, usually with a very crude black and white type of apocalypticism. Now, these are the more notorious and extremely well-connected individuals with VC funds. We've met at least one of them so far. That have financed most of the prominent military AI-type technology companies in the past decade. That includes our good friend Peter Thiel, co-founder of Palantir. He made his billions with PayPal, and he runs a VC company called Founders Fund, which funds Anduril, Palantir, SpaceX, Scale AI, OpenAI, DeepMind, among many other firms. It also includes Marc Andreessen here at the top, this man in the white shirt and the bald head. Marc Andreessen and his venture capital firm, Andreessen Horowitz, which also funds Anduril, Palantir, SpaceX, Shield AI, and others. And it also includes, so Marc Andreessen has made his money with Netscape. And then it includes former Google CEO turned US National Security Advisor Eric Schmidt, who has significant investments in a number of military AI startups. So you get the picture. They are very powerful, significant, very vocal characters that shape the landscape. And even though they technically all compete with their various venture funds and endeavors, they do all work quite closely together to build a defense infrastructure that each of these Silicon Valley-oriented companies can ultimately capitalize on. So that's really important. So Eric Schmidt has a weekly call with all the AI companies. So there's a network in place that forges the landscape within which we ultimately then live. And this has been going on for a good decade. So this kind of movement started around 2014. In 2011, Mark Andreessen wrote a blog post in which he muses, well, he writes a lot of blog posts, but in this particular one, it's quite interesting because he says, it's titled, "Software is Eating the World." Well, you could understand this as a kind of a critical warning, but really, looking back over a decade now, we know now that it was a declaration of intent indeed to disrupt all arenas of human affairs, and that includes that of warfare. In his words, he says, in order to succeed, Silicon Valley-style entrepreneurs ultimately will be, and this is a quote from him, invading and overturning established industry structures in all domains. So that was the plan. Now, Andreessen Horowitz and others have subsequently made it their mission to disrupt military infrastructures and to reframe warfare as primarily a software problem. Again, this has been going on for a good decade at this point. Wars, so the credo was then forged, will be won by those with the best software products, now with the best AI products. But in order to win wars with software, the rest of the world and its ways must bend to what software needs. And that necessitates large-scale disruption, and that necessitates a change in defense culture. Now, that wars will be won by software is a blatantly ahistorical suggestion. It doesn't take into consideration the limits of software or the fact that wars are not an engineering problem or a technological problem, but a human problem ultimately. It doesn't take into consideration the nature of violence or warfare, or in fact that we can barely prognosticate reliably our future even 10 years ahead. But it is quite an effective narrative, or it has become so. The ethos remains at the heart of initiatives such as Andreessen Horowitz's American Dynamism, which provides venture capital funding to build out America's defense and security infrastructure. There's another fund, America's Frontier Fund, which is a recent venture capital enterprise which is backed by Eric Schmidt, by Peter Thiel, by Andreessen and others. And both initiatives offer really a bit of a glimpse into the wider aspirations for disruption and the potential for disruption more broadly this inevitably entails, disruption of all our lives ultimately. Now, both of these funds focus on technologies for the national interests, and they are part of what is known in Silicon Valley as patriotic capital. So this is a patriotic capital. It's kind of like a venture capital rush towards defense investments and a kind of like a swing towards supporting patriotic ideas. If you were less charitable, you could call it a revival of jingoism, but really it's this patriotic capital that is all the rage at the moment. Now, to this end, apocalyptic narratives are very often mobilized around AI as the inevitable technology that determines our future, whether that is a good future or a bad future. And it kind of goes hand in hand with narratives about frontierism, patriotism, and a general ethos of actual settler colonialism that underwrites the narratives of VC funding for defense and security, at least as it is presented by some companies. One prominent line of propaganda, and we can scarcely call it anything other than propaganda, perhaps marketing if you wanted to. So one of these lines conjures up the inevitability of conflict, of large-scale conflict. It is on the horizon between righteous nations, America and its allies, and evil China. It used to be Russia, but Russia is now slightly immobilized, so now China is really the irresponsible enemy at large. And is often couched in an exaggerated discourse about good and evil, whereby evil can be many things, from a hostile nation to those that are against the unfettered rollout of technology, or those that are against, that are in favor of regulation and that are in favor of legally insured rights for everyone. So evil cast in a very broad kind of context. Now, valorized, you see it in the promotional videos that are from Palantir here. Valorized in these visions is a technology as a force for good, right? Equal parts majestic, but awesome, a little bit awful and awe-inspiring, but certainly in some ways destructive. This new militarism for peace is ultimately unapologetically bellicose. It deals in visions of death, visions of destruction, visions of domination, and I am, as I was putting this together, I was really reminded of Susan Sontag's discussion of Leni Riefenstahl's work in her essay, in Susan Sontag's essay, Fascinating Fascism, reflected really in some of these often AI-generated visions of valorized war technologies and their genius makers. There's always somebody conducting something, are familiar themes of longing, of purity, of death, of power, and of what Sontag calls a characteristic pageantry. Turning people into things, this is a quote from her, turning people into things, the multiplication or replication of things, the grouping of people or things around an all-powerful, hypnotic leader figure of force, an orgiastic transaction between mighty forces and their puppets, uniformly garbed and shown in ever-swelling numbers. The technology here, AI, is both the awesome force, where the swelling numbers of mighty enforcers emanate from, orchestrated often around a frontman, a hype man, a charismatic leader, a defense influencer, you might say, like Andrew Rill's Palmer Luckey or Palantir's Alex Karp, outrageous men who deliberately cultivate a kind of a spiritual following and who place their faith squarely in the capabilities of the technology. Not least because it makes them a lot of money, of course, but also because mysticism sells. Catherine Boyle, she's a partner at Andreessen Horowitz. She leads the American dynamism effort. And here's a clip from, not a clip, a still from when she spoke at the Defense Venture Summit a couple of years ago. The Defense Venture Summit is a very important industry event where appetite for investments in defense products is stoked. And in her very patriotic speech, she declared that technology is the backbone of maintaining this American order of civilization, and it always will be, she says. America must, and this is a quote from her, win a war against evil ideologies, and technology is ultimately the escape hatch for a nihilistic world. These are her words. Now, by the end of her speech, she had really talked herself into a veritable frenzy about the war America must face and the role of technology in this war in order for civilization and civilizational values to triumph. She says, we are making a choice to build new things. They may fail because we believe not only can the future be better than the past, but it has to be better than the past, and so on and so forth. And she ends on a very patriotic note. She says, because we know that American dynamism is true and the key to a more prosperous civilization. This is a venture capital event. Now, it was a rousing speech, really, which betrays an American version of eschatology and kind of like an already there-ness of a kingdom. God has arrived in America without the apocalypse, if you will. The apocalypse, however, remains potent as an instrumental trope. And it is quite easy to see, and in some ways it's the obvious way to think about this, how this crude casting of good and evil against an always latent conjuring up of deeply existential and extremely urgent crises is leveraged to great effect. And she's not the only one. These emergency plot lines are really extremely pervasive in this space. So these apocalyptic emergency type of plot lines, they always tend to be tied to violence as a cleansing force, and with that, they tend to serve as a mode of justification. Robert Lifton, the psychologist, calls this outlook a apocalyptic world purification, and violence plays a really instrumental role in that. This is also an outlook that has been extremely effective for many a cult in the past. Now, techno-eschatological tropes circulate in the wider AI space as well, in quite stark ways, oscillating always sharply between utopia and dystopia. AI as the pathway potentially, as Sam Altman tells us here, to massive prosperity in a future, he says, so bright that nobody can do it justice by writing about it just now. We cannot possibly imagine. But it also revolves around a range of darker prognostications, such as Eric Schmidt's warning that AI may pose an existential risk, which he defines as many, 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 many people killed or harmed. Of course, always obscured in these techno-elite narratives is the fact that these elites have exactly a hand and, of course, vested interests in producing AI technologies and shaping their overall capacities and limitations, or lack of limitations, I should say. And with that, of course, they have a significant financial interest in focusing all our attention on AI as an extraordinary, more than human, powerful, opaque phenomenon that requires elucidation and careful handling by those with expertise and expert knowledge, by those able to interpret and guide the power of AI, and thus create a milieu in which AI becomes both myth and ordering principle for human life. And I find this mythologizing angle really, really quite fascinating, not least because it seems to lean, and this is a bit of a detour, it seems to lean in sometimes quite overt ways on the annihilation fantasies and other tropes of Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. In fact, looking at some of the literature, you could argue that Lord of the Rings might, in fact, constitute an ideational scaffold for many of the rich and powerful today. There are many examples, but I want to highlight Italy's Giorgia Meloni, who worships the Tolkien trilogy, which she considers an absolutely sacred text. And Italy has a longer fascination with Lord of the Rings and those kinds of texts, especially in the far right. They organized in the 1970s, they organized a series of hobbit camps as political gatherings. J.D. Vance is also quite deeply influenced by Lord of the Rings ideas and ideologies. His mentor, Peter Thiel, has read the trilogy at least 10 times, reportedly, and he has named many of his investment firms and other firms after artifacts from the trilogy. There's an in-joke in venture capital circles that his company, Founders Fund, is nicknamed The Precious. Relatedly, the two military companies that Thiel has founded, or funds, Palantir and Anduril, are named, of course, after Lord of the Rings, Seeing Stones and the Flame of the West, respectively. And here it's interesting, if we listen to Anduril frontman, hype man, Palmer Luckey, explaining the motivation for naming the company after this fictional sword in the trilogy. And he says, the reason this name Anduril spoke to me, whether it's true or not, I don't know. The reason this spoke to me is the idea of the flame of the West, the sword that is inherently good, fights for good, is wielded by the kingdom of men against the hordes of Mordor, and a sword that is inherently created to fight evil. So that's what he names his company after. So that's an ethos, that's an ideology, the company is taking sides. It wants to, and here's another quote, fight for the things that our country values, that our allies around the world have in common. And this is still his words, for the kingdom of men fighting against the hordes of Mordor. That's what he wants Anduril ultimately to be, a company for the salvation of civilization. Now, reflected in this love for crude Tolkien fantasies, I think is a desire for control over a world of perhaps less complexity, maybe limited plurality, a world in which clear roles and capacities are assigned, where identities are fixed, everybody knows who's who and what's what. And perhaps, thinking about Paul's talk earlier, perhaps a world in which the principle of optimal brain damage operates in some ways, where unimportant weights and parameters are selectively removed, where what counts, of course, as what is optimal and accurate and desirable is always curated, and where trade-offs are necessarily always baked into the equation. So, repeated claims about AI then become fact, right? About AI as doom or salvation. What becomes fact is what becomes sacred, and what is sacred must then be defended ultimately. And this is, I think, perhaps the context against we can make sense of what Sam Altman says in advocating in the most literal sense for let's do what we need to do to defend the sacred. When he says whether we burn 500 million a year or 5 billion a year or 50 billion a year, or as it turns out 500 billion a year with the Stargate project. I don't care, he says, I genuinely don't. As long as we can figure out a way to pay the bills, we are making AGI, artificial general intelligence. Now, in a world of rising global inequality, this reckless allocation and myopic allocation of financial resources and dogged pursuit of AI is, I think, again, a declaration of intent, an intent to do what is needed, perhaps to foreclose other possibilities. Similarly, Eric Schmidt muses that at a conference last year, he said, we won't meet our climate goals anyways, so we shouldn't hold back actually with developing more energy-hungry data centers, resource-intensive AI models. In fact, we should do more. Bigger AIs, faster supercomputers, larger and more powerful data centers, no matter what, in the faith that AI will sort out a sustainable future for us, hopefully swiftly. This is what he said. Now, implicit here is the most overt and perhaps also blatant path towards model collapse. Nadim spoke about this in the introduction to the tour earlier on. This new military, industrial, technological, spiritual complex has a tremendous and significant environmental cost associated with it. The military has not in any way a significant military cost, environmental cost associated with it, but with the introduction of artificial intelligence, that becomes significantly amplified. Now, we know that ChatGPT is extremely power hungry, right? So it clocks up the daily usage that could power about energy usage that could power about 180,000 US households. One ChatGPT query requires 500 milliliters of water. That's one. We also know, of course, that generative AI systems at large, whether these are the ones where you can turn your likeness into a Barbie or whether you create a Ghibli cartoon, they require enormously potent data centers, which in turn require the annual energy capacity of around 117 nation states combined. So it's shockingly large, these numbers, almost beyond comprehension for us. And we also already know that the big technology companies have begun to throw most of their carbon neutral pledges out of the window as of late. This incentive for financial gains of the AI pie within reach by far outweighs any environmental concerns, it seems. And so it's against perhaps this very reckless background that we might consider one of Trump's latest and by extension also the technology elite's latest follies, and that is the desire to capture Greenland by whatever means necessary, possibly also military means. The climate crisis will usher in a new land grab, but I think it already is. The climate change itself is melting ice caps, and in doing so, it creates new Arctic shipping routes. These shipping routes have increased already by 37% over the last 10 years, and they are likely to increase as a geopolitical contest over these shipping routes. But also the melting ice caps. Melting ice more broadly harbors the promise for access to untapped resources, especially in Greenland, whether that's iron ore, gold, or other rare earth metals. So there's something attractive, speaking with financial terms or in financial terms, about Greenland. So it presents a financial opportunity at large for the new breed of VC investors. The latest crypto-fueled project, financed by exactly the same people that finance military AI weapons, is a series of independent states, city-states. This is part of the network state movement. This one here, Praxis Nation, is a VC-funded independent state. For now, it's inexistent only online, but it has aspirations to settle somewhere in the physical realm. So it works kind of like a special economic zone. It is crypto-based, and it has as its ethos the acceleration of technological progress. I'm not sure if they still do it, but in previous marketing copy, as you can see, the ethos was to build the future of the West. I think they've tampered that down at this point. Now, you can become a citizen, any one of you can. In order to do so, you must pay, of course, but you must also pledge to, and this is a quote from the pledge, to embody the spirit of transcendence through heroic actions and thought, and to commit to the creation of this new nation and future city where certain ideals and values will flourish. So if you're ready to do that, there's your gateway. The founder of Praxis has set his eyes for a physical location onto none other than Greenland, of course, for a new crypto tech utopia, come what may. Now, perhaps another illustration of this very reckless ethos, neatly encapsulated by an event that took place last year in October. So in October 2024, Thiel's company Founders Fund hosted a ball. It's called the Hereticon Apocalypse Ball. It's an invite-only event for investors, tech entrepreneurs, wannabe tech entrepreneurs, everybody with sufficient clout and money in that kind of environment. So they come together and exchange ideas, wild ideas, crackpot ideas, actually mostly, which will, and this is an aspirational quote, which will ultimately transform our world for the better or destroy it. This is marketing copy. Now the ball showcased a roster of interesting ideas, like how to make an ice age with aerosol injections, how to transport icebergs to the Mediterranean and then live there, why fossil fuels are a moral good, and also why pillows are bad. But it also suggested why America needs Greenland. So that was in October 2024. So disruption at all costs, mostly for financial gain. The marketing copy, again, of the invite to the event makes this ethos very clear. Maybe if you're not trying to destroy the world, you're not trying hard enough. So the desire encapsulated by these projects, by this worldview, is one of being able to do what one wants at all costs, to remain ultimately unencumbered by laws, by rules, unencumbered by others, by unwelcome external limitations, unencumbered by annoying people around one's vicinity that could otherwise be seen as disposable, or NPCs perhaps. So it's an unwillingness to truly consider the public in earnest that is baked into this kind of ethos. And so here I want to turn my attention to perhaps the most obvious part, or perhaps the most controversial part. I don't know, you'll be the judge of that. And I, in this last part, want to talk about artificial idiocy. There's something unmistakably idiotic in today's digital condition. I think we can probably all agree on that. Whether that is Elon Musk, of course, swinging a chainsaw as his minions enact the Silicon Valley fantasy of efficiency and optimization via Doge, which ultimately is, in most ways, just a means for reallocating budgets in different forms of experimentation and different forms of waste, or whether that is most of us looking on to this, relatively helpless in the face of these extraordinarily senseless developments, senseless in the political sense. And so I wonder whether this might be one of the most starkly crucial upshots of the age of artificial intelligence. 2 decades ago, Jean Baudrillard observed that what the tyranny of AI leads to, that's a quote, his quote, most truly, he says, is the birth of a previously unknown stupidity, artificial stupidity, he says, deployed everywhere on the screens and on the computer networks. In this, AI itself is stupid, as it prefers, and this is his quote, to overlook the eternal duel between intelligence and stupidity. Far from being a reflection of human intelligence, the AI ecology gives us quite the contrary. The computer, Baudrillard says, a decade before he said the thing about the AI, the computer, he says, the computer is not intelligent. Computers work so quickly because they are unlinked to otherness. Intelligence comes to us from the other always. This is the political crux, perhaps, of our AI times, not artificial intelligence, but artificial idiocy as the others disappear for us and to us. Now, the term idiot, as it is known today, is a swear word, an expression of dismay or perhaps superiority. It's used to denigrate something or someone. But it really is the original Greek meaning of the word idiot that I want to point our attention towards. The root of the word is idios, which means private, self-focused, separate from others. And so in the original sense of the word, a person was deemed an idiot when they're primarily focused on their own private matters, unaware of common goods, or lacking the skill or lacking the wherewithal to contribute ultimately meaningfully to broader society. So in its original term, use of the term or sense of the term, idiot stands in contrast to the person who was a public citizen, a politus. Now, perhaps this distinction allows us to see the term as a signifier of cognitive capability and maturity as it relates to politics. I take a lot of this from Walter Park's really lovely essay on teaching against idiocy, which he wrote in 2004. I think he's more hopeful than I am about what can be done. He says, idiots are immature in its most fundamental way. Their lives are out of balance, disoriented, untethered, and unrealized. Tragically, idiots have not yet met the challenge of puberty, which is the transition to public life. Now, from a very early point in the usage of the word, it had a negative connotation. It was always frowned upon to merely pursue one's own solipsistic interests without regard for the public and its interest. As a mental state, it was seen as an exception, or at least something that needs to be transcended and overcome as one learns more about the world and develops empathy. The meaning of the word idiot, I think, helps us, me at least, clarify a fundamental theoretical point. Namely, political theoretical, that is. The individual and society are intrinsically interwoven, right? Without cultivating an attentiveness to the workings, needs, and desires of the whole, no individual can ultimately thrive in the long run. A core value then is, or should be, to cultivate public-mindedness, or institutions that cultivate public-mindedness. But I fear that we are moving slowly but surely in the opposite direction, because I feel that the digital present doesn't stack up so well against this mandate towards public-mindedness and towards developing the skills, the capabilities necessary to participate meaningfully in public life. A lot of the new technologies that surround us, especially under the sign of AI, are designed to encroach more and more on the types of tasks humans are usually doing as it pertains to public life, whether that is engaging with texts that others have written, whether that is creating texts, whether that is sending something out into the world or receiving something from the world, from job applications to making life and death decisions. The transformative powers that our current AI technologies hold is that perhaps of turning us into solipsistic, non-public citizens with ever-diminishing skills, ever-diminishing knowledge and expertise to contribute meaningfully to public affairs at large. We are incapacitating our public selves, perhaps making ourselves unfit for public life. We become idiots. It's perhaps a denigration of political possibility on account of artificial feedback loops gone wrong, ultimately the essence of model collapse. Now, this kind of idiocy, I think, is currently at work at the high-level strata of US politics, and with reports proliferating as to how AI will be inserted into absolutely all walks of life and governmental processes, this is not likely to change. And this is not just in the US, this is also happening certainly in the UK to some degree, and other countries too. Now, to end, problematically, I think those that stand to gain most financially from the proliferation of AI, those recurring characters, I want to say, they are cultivating or perhaps normalizing a perpetually prepubescent state. The number of adults in the room, in some of the rooms at least, seems to be diminishing, and those that are left become often subservient to a handful of very powerful juveniles who have managed to pull the wool over too many eyes. It's a mode of interaction that plays out really all too vividly, and especially in this shocking scenario here. Where idiocy reigns, cruelty is often not very far. Roland Meyer, whose work on AI kitsch I really appreciate, has identified this tendency, especially in generative AI slop, which the Trump-Musk administration is so very, very fond of, which he says works as a narcissistic wish fulfillment machine, an amplifier of racist and sexist stereotypes. Others have made similar observations, just pointing here towards Gareth Watkins, who has linked the AI slop aesthetic to postmodern conservatism, which has, and this is a quote from him, enshrined acting like a spoiled 15-year-old boy as the organizing principle of the reactionary movement. A way of life, or politics perhaps, where childish tantrums, this is his quote again, are accompanied by equally childish playground-level bullying, he writes, and I think that was on full display in the scene here. So we see this play out also amongst those who have vested interests in the new military industries, whether that is Palantir CEO Alex Karp up here, making at almost every event that I've watched at least clumsy, lewd jokes about not getting laid at his company events, or declaring that a good foreign policy approach would be to inflict generational pain on anyone who hurts an American. Or whether that is Anduril CEO Palmer Luckey here, moaning that working with weapons isn't as much fun as working with headsets. He used to be at Oculus before he became a weapons manufacturer. And he's always seen to complain that nobody believed him, but he proved them all wrong, suckers. So there's a very juvenile tone about all of these people. One of their colleagues also proclaims that he ended up in the weapons industry because really he wanted to be James Bond, but then he entered the government and he said government work is so boring, so he started a weapons company. Or on show here, this clip, a host of grown men in their 50s and 60s, amongst them the world's richest men, collectively worth many, many billions, making jokes about penises and erections at a public convention. And if you have the stomach for it, I recommend watching the last 7 minutes of this dreadful scene. Here, you might infer what this is about just by the hand gestures. Now, this affinity for lewd jokes is often paired with a crude pop philosophy, which I would package Curtis Yarvin under. And it is as off-putting as it is telling. It seems to portray a certain immaturity, emotionally and intellectually, by a cast of men who simply know that their actions will have no real consequences, at least not for them. So with greater public-mindedness comes usually a greater awareness of how society functions and what role one plays within society. And only if we're collectively deprived of the tools to understand society in those ways, only when we're deprived of these tools can idiocy ultimately flourish. So what do? I don't know. To push against this age of artificial idiocy, perhaps we need to strengthen our institutions, our ways of collective civility, our norms, and recognize perhaps that the broader AI ecology is very likely to enroll us into political idiocy, at least even further, all the while eroding our agency, our skills, our knowledge base, and our ability to resist political cruelty. And without a foundation of this public-mindedness, this thoughtless cruelty embedded in idiocy will become the norm. I'll end here on this cheerful note. Thank you for listening.
Well, cheerful indeed. Thank you so very much, Elke Schwarz. We have gone on pretty far into the hour, but I do think there's probably one or two burning questions in the room, and I wouldn't like to leave you without that opportunity. Would someone like to ask Elke a question? Yes, over here. Microphone coming out.
Hello. I was interested in looking at... I'm over here. Oh. Yes, okay, a bit small. When Starlink was announced, and then I was looking into the kind of etymology, and I had no idea that it referred back to, or it could be alluding to, a 70s program. Was it by the CIA, with the psychic readings and things? And I can't remember the documentary name's maker, but then the accompanying thing was about the Iraq War and how possibly you could, an agent can see, you know, beyond through walls, so to speak. And I just wondered, is there any of this kind of thinking going on in the military at the moment, you know, with implants and things for emotions and happiness and national lust to war? Is there anything like that going on?
So here we straddle the line between DARPA and Black Mirror in some ways. So if you can imagine it, then I'm pretty sure somebody at DARPA, which is a defense kind of research agency that the US, the Wildcat kind of like let your thoughts run wild agency, somebody has dreamed that up already. Now this is increasingly folded into the private tech companies, this kind of activity. But usually anything that you've ever seen in a sci-fi film will have been a project for military endeavors. That's yeah. I think usually they take a lot of the ideas from sci-fi films without understanding what the sci-fi film wants to say about it, and they're just really enthralled by the technological possibility or impossibility, and then it becomes about conquering the impossibility of the technology, not really thinking about what it might, you know, unleash. But yeah, certainly these things are underway, and of course, one of the companies that is on a couple of these venture capital companies' docket or portfolio is Neuralink, which is Elon Musk's, you know, chip implant endeavor. And of course, the idea is to link it all, you know. So, yeah, these things are underway. Whether they will materialize or not is a different story. I think it depends on how much financial upshot there can be in those kinds of technologies. And I think at some point people will draw the line, you know. I hope.
So there was one more over here.
Thank you so much for this dark story. There was just one thing that caught my attention. It was going back to what you said about war, these companies kind of figuring war as a software problem. But you said, but war isn't a software problem, it's a human problem. And there's some sense in which I'm very inclined to agree with that. But then from everything you've said, I think you've also shown how much they are turning war into a software problem. And I wondered if you could say a little more about that. And also maybe it suggests a little bit about how we might look for strategies for avoiding or resisting becoming kind of, figures in the multiplayer game that they're trying to turn the world into.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely on point. So the war isn't a software problem. It never will be a software problem. But the endeavor to frame it as such, that has been going on for a long time. And that includes changing the defense structures, so changing procurement structures, financial structures, changing ideas about how technology is rolled out and tested to make it in the image of Silicon Valley as an industry, ultimately. And kind of in the image of the technology itself, right? It becomes all about agility, it becomes about trial and error, it becomes about experimentation and constant iteration. So where previously we had technologies where, it's a long contracting process, testing is very robust and rigorous, and unless it is at least reasonably tested in the field, it will not be rolled out. Now you have technologies that are rolled out in the field, live conflicts, tested, iterated, they fail, you iterate. So the entire model of the defense changes to become in the image of Silicon Valley, ultimately. So it's a kind of a holistic ecology that is created, which makes it very difficult to resist against it. Now, on the surface, that then might cohere with the idea that that war is just a software problem. But ultimately, it doesn't take seriously the humans again, right? It doesn't take seriously the people and what the people will do, and the fact that war is all about surprises and the unexpected, and the fact that there's always a counter push, right? So, in response to that, I don't really know what to do to resist, other than to do what I'm doing all the time, talk to military audiences and tell them that, that's not a good idea to turn everything into an AI kind of environment. But I think it's most important to really, really understand the technology and the limitations of the technology. And I think that goes for all walks of life, right? So not be enthralled by the possibilities as they are advertised for AI, but rather how does this relate to what I need to do? Or how does this relate, where are the limits of this technology ultimately?